Okay, so Aristotle, Descartes, and Bloom, frenemies or BFFs. This is the title of my presentation tonight, which will explore philosophical approaches and taxonomies, exploring broadly and also within the context of distance learning. Do I have to press the? I have to press this. Okay, now it's not doing anything. Okay, wait. Okay, I found the right button. Okay. So I'll start by briefly summarizing the Canuka reading from this week, which maps out philosophies of technology with philosophies of education. And note that I use the word education here, not learning, as the philosophical approaches that Canuka discusses really have more to do with teaching. So regarding philosophies of technology, there are two categories delineated by differing beliefs about the impacts of technology and how technology is constituted in relation to society. In other words, the neutrality versus the non-neutrality of technology. And this spectrum encompasses three broad categories that are shown on this slide. And I won't detail these here, but the important thing to take away from this is that it's a difference in beliefs about where agency resides within the technology context user construct, and whether how we use technology shapes that technology, whether technology shapes our uses of technology, and how these processes are embedded within social contexts. And these beliefs are important because, these beliefs are important because they influence how educators approach the integration of technology into their practice. Are the slides moving for everyone okay? Got it? No, they are not. Okay, I'm just going to resync it and see if I can get it to move. So does everyone see the title page right now? Okay. And does everyone see a slide that says philosophies of technology, technological determinism? Okay. So that was the slide that I just summarized. Do you want me to go over the summary again? Okay. Okay, so this slide just summarizes the Canuka reading from this week, and it maps out philosophies of technology with philosophies of education. And I use the word education here because instead of learning, because these philosophical approaches that Canuka discusses really have more to do with teaching. So regarding philosophies of technology, there are two categories that are delineated by differing beliefs about the impacts of technology and how technology is constituted in relation to society, and in other words, the neutrality or non-neutrality of technology. So this spectrum encompasses three categories that are shown here in this slide. And I won't detail these here, but the important thing to take away from this is that it's a difference in beliefs about where agency resides within the technology context user construct, and whether how we use technology shapes that technology, whether technology shapes our uses, and how these processes are embedded within social contexts. These beliefs are important because, I'll click the right button here. Okay, is everyone on slide number 2? Yes, okay. Awesome. Okay, so these beliefs are important because they influence how educators approach the integration of technology into their practice. And this figure on this slide depicts 6 philosophies of education that Canuka explores. Each are aligned with one of the 3 philosophies of technology from the previous slide. And you'll notice how instructional design emerges from the aim of each approach and then translates into different beliefs about and different ways of using technology as a means for achieving these aims. And you'll also notice the position of teacher and learner and their relationship. And each of these in each of these constructs and how the technology facilitates a type of interaction that aligns with the aims. So what I find especially interesting is how the same philosophy of technology is articulated differently through different approaches to education. So taking a look at the liberal perennial versus the behaviorist, both of which intersect with technological determinism, and progressive versus humanist versus analytical, which aligns with usage determinism. Okay. Is everyone on the next slide? I think it's working now. Okay, so as educators, as leaders, and even as students, it's important to have an awareness of how your own philosophies of technology and education intersect, as well as those of others, because these beliefs shape how technology is incorporated into practice and learning, how the affordances of technologies are matched to learning experiences and learning outcomes. And this awareness is especially important for distance education because of the central presence of technology as a mediator. So congruency between belief and action within distance education is imperative. In general, there are implications for matching technology choice and use to instructional design. During orientation week, Jessica, you described how faculty would come to you interested in the latest technology toys. I think Oculus Rift was the example you used, and I've experienced similar things with my faculty who they're really excited about gamification and they want to gamify their courses, but they don't understand what gamification is or how to connect it to student learning experiences and learning outcomes. And this is problematic, not the least of which reason being that practice and student learning are treated as separate domains. So thinking about this, I had some difficulty deciding which of these philosophies, and I'll go back to the previous slide, which of these philosophies these faculty might align with, and I'm wondering if you guys have any thoughts. Am I talking too fast? I do that. I'll try to slow down a bit, but I only have 45 minutes, and I'll try to speak up as well. Okay. So before continuing, I just wanted to take a moment to mention the SAMR model, and it's one that I find quite useful to help me think about the what, how, and why for integrating technology in learning. It depicts a spectrum from enhancement to transformation. And Michael, this is the one that I think I mentioned to you during orientation week. And I'm just going to click ahead here. So there's no assertion that transformation of learning is the ultimate end goal in this model. Rather, this model is meant to help match up objectives, design, and tech integration. And I think the SAMR model is situated somewhere within either the progressive or humanist philosophical approach or both. Our uses and the purposes for which we use technology shape or transform what that tool is. SAMR means it's the letters that correspond to the different domains in this model. So S is substitution, augmentation, modification, and redefinition. So if you think about it, for instance, in an LMS, we have the simple assignment drop box, and it can serve an administrative purpose. So it substitutes for students handing in assignments on paper. But it can also allow students to submit multimedia assignments, such as videos or web-based cognitive maps. So it can serve as an augmentation or modification purpose in that respect. And then moving further up the SAMR spectrum, just as an example, I recently implemented a self-directed student remediation cycle that combines different Moodle activities using automated feedback options that direct students to engage this remediation cycle when they have a failing grade. And I built the infrastructure for this using the quiz activity as a space for reflection, reporting, tracking, and communication between the student and the instructor. And it's all led by the student. So that would be somewhere along the lines of redefinition. The LMS is allowing different learning tasks that were previously impossible. Okay, so moving on, I'm going to talk about taxonomy now. And we're all probably familiar with various taxonomies. They're present throughout the arts and sciences, and as educators, you've probably had some exposure to Bloom's taxonomy, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. I'll just start here by providing a brief definition about what is a taxonomy. It's a classification system organizing phenomena into categories in a way that explains change relationships. And this is the key aspect, explaining change relationships. At what point phenomena are alike, and at what point phenomena become different. When does a wolf become a husky? Can you tell looking at these pictures which one is the husky and which one is the wolf? Can anyone tell the difference? The husky is on the left. That's right. And just because this guy on the right is smiling doesn't mean it's a dog. And no, dogs cannot actually smile. I do know that. Okay, so unless you're familiar with relational databases and have some experience with them, the classification system you're most likely familiar with is the linear hierarchical system, which expresses conditional parent-child relationships amongst domains and taxa. Cats and tigers are alike and different because they are subtypes of felines. In linear hierarchies, it's possible to express universality. For instance, all thumbs are fingers, but not all fingers are thumbs. But there's another type of classification system, which I will descriptively call a rhizomal type. And this type expresses relationships through predication. And what that means is that something is both itself while simultaneously being an example of something else. So a Tesla 3 is a Tesla 3, and it's also an automobile. In library and information science, faceted classification systems are one type of rhizomal taxonomy. And if you think of the facets in, like picture a prism and how the different planes of the prism come together in different positions to catch the light, and they express different color displays depending on the position that they're in relation to each other. So both types of classification systems embed the principle of complexity, wherein broader categories describe either subordinate categories, subordinate phenomena, or narrower phenomena. And it's this principle of complexity which allows for modularity, granularity, and combinatorial flexibility, particularly in rhizomal or faceted classification systems, which pull phenomena together as fluid or custom categories premised on affinity of attributes. And in the Leisnick reading from this week, it identifies the principles of taxonomic function as being dynamic, which means capable of change, robust, which means representing all relevant attributes without being reductionist, and parsimonious, which means graspable or usable without being an oversimplification. So as I continue through my presentation, please keep in mind this idea of rhizomal systems compared to hierarchical systems, and especially in terms of how each fosters the three taxonomic functions that I just described. All right, so again here I note the distinction between education versus learning. And I would say that the majority of taxonomies within our discipline are taxonomies of education, even though some are labeled taxonomies of learning. So in teaching, taxonomies serve pretty much as guides for instructional design, suggesting what types of learning are enabled by which learning experiences. And there are two general types of taxonomies. There are descriptive taxonomies and prescriptive taxonomies. And just to read from the Leisnick article this week, descriptive taxonomies our organizational schema for classifying the structure of conditions for learning, describing the approaches, types, events, methods, goals, or instruction, versus prescriptive taxonomies, which are an organizational scheme for specifying the optimal and appropriate approaches, types, events, methods, blah, 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 of instruction to achieve corresponding specific learning objectives and desired performance outcomes. So it's prescriptive taxonomies I'll focus on here as they relate to instructional design, and we'll consider how taxonomies explain how a learner transitions from passive receptive knowledge acquisition to active emergent knowledge creation and identify ways to facilitate this transformation. The Leisnick article notes that while there are prescriptive taxonomies for media in learning, there are few for distance education and online learning, and I'd also throw into that mixed blended learning as well. For explaining the unique affordances of connected digital environments for learning and the change relationships amongst domains that are enabled by these affordances. In particular, learning that is mediated through and afforded by interaction, as well as the separation of learner from their teacher and peers in distance education. So different learning experiences, different taxa, different domains, and different change relationships. In distance education, online learning, blended learning, technology in general is embedded within and constitutive of learning experiences and contexts. Are they flipping again? Okay, most of you look good. Okay, I'll continue. So a taxonomy that responds to distance education and online learning contexts might include revised conceptions of relationships amongst actors, including tools, and responsibility of tasks, for instance, containing domains that map to new learning outcomes that these enable, such as collective knowledge creation, connected learning, learner metacognition, and self-direction. And I note here as well on my slide that design emerges out of, oh, sorry, that note is out of scope. Okay, I'll go into my next slide. So here we've got Bloom's taxonomy, which is used predominantly in contemporary teaching and instructional design. The original Bloom's was published in 1956 by a consortium of whom Bloom was one member. And then in 2001, it was revised by Anderson and Krathwohl, and that's the middle column there. A few observations. Bloom's is organized as a hierarchy of domains that embed scaffolding and explains change relationships as a linear progression through the leveled domains. And a few other observations I make about Bloom's is that the original Bloom's, it seems to privilege external performance rather than learner engagement and internal learning processes. And it also privileges the role of teacher in interpreting performances as a proxy indicator of learning that takes place internally. It doesn't describe learning from the perspective of what the learner does during the learning process. It privileges product, not process. And these are weaknesses that the revised Bloom's attempted to address. Notice the switch to action verbs, which better explain what learners are doing as they are learning. And notice also the change in the top two domains, which correspond to ordinal differences among domain relationships. Now this change, it was premised on a shift in job function in the workplace between managers and their subordinates within a Western workplace context, in which the innovation and tasks involving creativity have since become more important than the task of evaluating relating to managers delegating tasks to subordinates who would then synthesize information and produce curated pieces for use by their managers. So one thing that this revision indicates is that Bloom's is dynamic. in terms of taxonomic function. And from this example, we also see how Bloom's was and still remains very much embedded within a specific socio-historical context. Hold on a second. Can you go ask Daddy, please? Thank you. All right, so a few other observations regarding Bloom's. Because it's presented as a hierarchy, it expresses conditional relationships with rigid boundaries. And this doesn't explain well the change relationships that involve learning experiences that cut across domains as a faceted taxonomy might explain. And I make this observation because this rigidity is inconsistent with my own experience as a learner. The Draper article that I don't know if you can see it. Oh, okay, it's missing from this slide. In my references list, you'll see an article by an author, Draper is the name. And Draper gives an example of a plumber who he has knowledge of each of the tools that he uses and what that tool is specifically meant to do. But in certain contexts, he will use tools for different purposes and come up with innovation. And this is the type of knowing that is divorced from, that Bloom's divorces in the learning experience. So therefore, Bloom's is not particularly robust, and its rigidity with conditional domains are characteristically reductionist. And here also in the right-hand box is an attempt to map technology-related actions onto Bloom's to explain learning within digital contexts. And you can see where this is where there's at least some alignment with interaction and collaboration infused into the different domains. And one final observation is that knowledge and knowing are presented as static in Bloom's, seemingly isolated from evaluation, for instance, which differs from connectivism's assertion that as essential 21st century skills include evaluating knowledge that may be obsolete. Okay, I'll just go ahead to the next slide here. Okay, and here's an attempt to map the levels of Bloom's taxonomy to a progression from teacher-centered to learner-centered design, mediated through technology integration. And this figure, it accounts for teaching presence in the different conceptions that we've been discussing in this course, such as role fluidity, with students sometimes taking on the role of teacher. And here's a similar attempt to map Bloom's to the Sammer model. However, with this model and the model from the previous slide, I think these are very static representations of technology in aligning with the domains that and whatever corresponding learning experiences they afford. And this rigidity it's inconsistent with my own experience as an instructional designer and a student. And Michael and Jessica, you probably have the same experience of using the same technology, the same apps, but for different purposes. Even for different purposes than for what they were originally developed for. And the uses in the learning experiences cross domains, they cross learning outcomes, they cross user experiences. So in that respect, I think this model misses the robustness piece of the puzzle. And this problem becomes even more apparent when we look at this elaboration of Bloom's integrated with Sammer, this pedagogy wheel, which I think is very popular, and I'm sure it can be a helpful guide for instructional design. However, it depicts very rigid boundaries between domains, and it fails to account for human creativity and innovation in adapting the same technology for diverse purposes. From the perspective of an instructional designer, another problem is that technology can change very rapidly. So when we're starting a project, and for many projects, this can be months or even a year in advance, it's difficult to predict how technology will change by the time, the point in time that implementation is reached, which may include new types of affordances for the learning by new technologies that have developed in the meantime. So a taxonomy that's too media dependent, like what's shown in this figure, is extremely reductionist, and it lacks flexibility with learning experiences emerging from the technology rather than from the change relationships amongst the domains. Okay. All right, so what jumps out at me about these attempts to overlay technology with blooms is that there appears to be an incongruence between usage determinism and technological determinism within each model, and reflects an approach that privileges design over learning. So another thing I think about is that for distance education, because of the mere presence of technology as a primary mediator, learning across all domains has already been redefined. So where does it fit with Bloom's, and where does it fit with the Summer model? The presence of tech in distance education doesn't necessarily mean this redefined learning necessarily maps directly to the higher level domains in these hierarchies. In other words, for distance education, these models explain differences in learning contexts, but not necessarily the change relationships that express learning. Bloom's seems situated within a behaviorist approach, embedding beliefs about technological determinism, which is problematic because, number one, Bloom's claims to be philosophically neutral, and two, since Bloom's is so predominantly used, there is a great deal of risk for incongruence between belief and action, which will undermine effective technological integration in instructional design. So in general, Bloom's has a significant flaw that's related to the fact that it's not represented as a networked system. It's a linear hierarchy. It fosters receptive learning that doesn't translate well into actual opportunities for scaffolding. It separates content from method, which decontextualizes content. It separates internal and external, including privileging the teacher as an external observer. Metacognition is knowledge about knowledge, but not about self-regulation. Overall, it takes an instrumentalist approach, which translates into a division between surface and deep learning that is problematic. Bloom's misses the important experiential aspect of learning, something that may not be as problematic were it not for this division between even greater domains that came out of the Bloom consortium. So we have the cognitive domain, which I just went over, and we also have the affective domain and the psychomotor domain, which I'll go over a little bit more in a few minutes. But this is a critical flaw in relation to, for instance, clinical contexts in which I work, where much student learning occurs from practice of physical skills and experiential knowledge, such as recognizing symptoms in a patient. And these are things that are covered by Bloom's affective domain and psychomotor domains, which are divorced from the cognitive domain that we've just been looking at. And this is also a flaw of Bloom's with respect to distance education, online and blended learning, and the unique experiential learning afforded through interaction with other people, with content, with technology tools, within more diverse group and individual learning contexts. Okay, so I went on a bit of a taxonomy scavenger hunt, and I found this visualization of Dale's cone of experience, which the Leisnick reading from this work this week refers to. And what I note is that action is better linked to content in this taxonomy in a way that infuses a media perspective without being too media dependent. Learning is connected to action. Learning is connected to action. Content, method, and experience are interconnected. And this taxonomy, it describes what the student experience is and starts to embed interaction and interrelation. And though it is media dependent to a degree, the scaffolding cuts across domains, allowing for better explanations of change relationships amongst the domains. And what I don't like about this particular visualization of the cone of experience is that, like Bloom's, it depicts a linear hierarchy in which the boundaries between the domains may be interpreted with rigidity, which could lead to a reductionist approach that privileges media over learning. And also because Dale originally envisioned his taxonomy as more of a spiral. So if we re-envision it as something more rhizomal or faceted, we get something like this. And we can start to imagine it as a complex, interrelated system and can see how change relationships may emerge through different combinatorial aggregations and coalescences across these domains to explain diverse learning experiences. And we can see the parts of the system and the whole system rather than just the parts. And this also gets at the concept of holism in learning that I think Morrison as well as Anderson and Garrison also talked about. So I looked at media ecology, which similarly presents a picture of a complex system with learning connected to action mediated by or enacted through technology. It's a media-dependent taxonomy. However, the Leisnick article describes how media ecology positions technology and content in the background and user needs in the foreground. Technology is viewed rather than as technology, allowing for learning activities to be reconceptualized as a hardware and software construct that affords the effective domain-type experiential learning, such as reflection, that support growth and transformation. Media ecology also fits better with my experience of using the same tech differently across the different levels of learning tasks and outcomes. So does media ecology explain change relationships? I'm not so sure, and I think that may be its own weakness as a prescriptive technology. So then I stumbled across this taxonomy in an article that explored economics and management and the phenomenon of creativity in the production of organizational knowledge or workplace knowledge. And I thought it was really interesting in its approach in that it looks like a hierarchy at first glance, but what emerges is a truly flexible process of combinatorial aggregations amongst antecedents and the user group aggregations within what the figure labels as the cumulative learning process. And I thought this taxonomy was especially interesting because I thought it may have some possible alignments with the categories of user aggregations that Drawn and Anderson proposed relating to social media, which are nets, sets, groups, and collectives. And you can read more about that in their book, Teaching Crowds, which is available through Athabasca University. All right. Okay, it's covering the word heuristic. So this is an example of a heuristic taxonomy. This one explains learning as a process of discovery mediated through interaction. And this figure depicts a complex system and the interrelatedness amongst the parts and between the parts and the overall system. And change relationships are expressed within the different regions that emerge from the experiential discovery process. Okay, and then as I was working through all of this, I was beginning to form an impression and maybe even an emerging idea in my mind. And then I found this model and I thought, OMG, this is exactly what I've been kind of searching for. So what the conversational framework depicts is a two-way learning process wherein learner and teacher not only interact but are interrelated. Learning occurs through a process combining interaction and individual inquiry. And I kind of get a sense of a self-scaffolding element in this framework and learners creating their own learning. In this framework, learning, action, and contexts are connected, and there seems to be some clarity in how design might emerge from the change relationships that are depicted. This framework was developed specifically in relation to technology, but I do note that it's not technology dependent, and nowhere in it does it specifically embed technology as part of the model. So the conversational framework, it accounts for collective knowledge creation, and in a very interesting way. The framework depicts a role for both teacher assessment and student assessment of the student's learning. So kind of a co-assessment model, which I think resonates with the proliferation of learning activities such as reflection, in which students take on the task of assessing their own learning. And in this, I also see a blurring of the rigidity between external and internal, that dichotomy there. So a few minutes ago, I mentioned that the separation of Bloom's cognitive, affective, and psychomotor domains meant important experiential learning was excluded from cognition. And what I think Lorilard's framework does here is to reintegrate those domains. Okay, and I just wanted to quickly show you Bloom's affective and psychomotor domains here. And I won't explain them to great extent here. I just wanted to put them up so you can see them. Wow, the font is really screwed up here. Response to phenomena is a separate one from receiving phenomena. And that's the affective domain. And then the psychomotor domain. This would also include physical and sensory skills, which I think may encompass some of the meta skills that connectivism describes, such as pattern recognition, and may be relevant for explaining learning that's relating to artificial intelligence. But that's another presentation. Wow, that one's really screwed up. Okay, this is supposed to show a two-way arrow between internal and external, and then a two-way arrow between private and public. So something that's really stood out to me through all of this is the different picture of dichotomies that emerged through these different models, frameworks, and taxonomies, and the tension between the divergence and integration, especially relating to internal versus external and public versus private versus public or collective spheres. So I'm not going to talk about Aristotle and Descartes for very, very much of my presentation, because if I get started, then we will be here all night. But I will say this. The philosophies of technology and education, along with all of the taxonomies that I've overviewed tonight, are embedded within a larger philosophical tradition and Euro-Western worldview. And in particular, they embed the concept of dualism, consistent with the Cartesian tradition of mind-body dualism. Learning is internal, but is expressed and assessed externally. And at the same time, they also embed some Aristotelian ideas and are beginning more so to gravitate towards that in terms of things like integration, empiricism, and reasoning. Aristotle's logic regarding how we know informed the development of early formal education contexts. We think of the dialectic method. And as well, science would not be what it is today without Aristotle. And it was within the context of industrialization that the Cartesian tradition supplanted Aristotle within formal education as the aim shifted to become producing a workforce. Okay. Oh, that slide looks actually quite good. Okay, so this figure visualizes Aristotle's logic regarding how we come to know, and I won't go into much detail except to point out that it's integration of experience and reflection, and the suggestion of the broader network or context in which these are embedded. And how Aristotle thought about how we come to know things is we take the metaphor of the person who slips on ice. They know more about the property of slipperiness of ice than the person who doesn't slip. But the person who thinks about the experience knows more about the slipperiness of ice than the person who just slips on ice. So it's that process of reflection that really takes us to that next level of knowing. So my thought then is whether as learning moves towards self-direction, might we also be seeing a philosophical shift towards the concepts of dualism and integration converging, so that each has a place in learning. And in relation to distance education, is this articulated through the different contexts that learners occupy, the different spheres where learning occurs and is enacted, such as right here on our course seminar, as well as within each of our local networks at work or elsewhere. I'm almost at the end. So here I wanted to mention that Aristotelian logic it's been identified in a number of non-Euro-Western cultures. This idea of interrelatedness, of part of one and the other, while the whole maintains its integrity as well. And I think this is a very important concept for education, particularly in relation to multicultural contexts and globalization. And I should, with this slide, before I leave this slide, just point out that these are observations that were made by male anthropologists within the Western cultural paradigm. So there's definitely some bias, I'm sure. All right. Yeah, so I guess my last point about that slide is just that this concept of networked systems better aligns with some of these diverse worldviews. Okay, and this is just a quick image of ecological systems theory, just to show you a visual conception of embeddedness within a web of contextual relationships. And if we click to this slide, here's a depiction of navigational taxonomy, which also depicts another networked system. This one is a faceted system. Actually, they're both faceted systems. I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to click ahead a bit here. So turning to connectivism, if we look at the principles of connectivism, we do not see it as a representation of learning as a linear hierarchy. Connectivism does not appear to embody complexity levels that might demarcate its domains into linear progression of learning or knowledge acquisition. Interdependence is expressed as collective learning across domains. And importantly, the learner is at the center of the learning process, including self-assessment of learning. And you know, looking at these principles again as I was preparing this presentation, one thing that I noted and hadn't noticed before is that it's really only the third point here that expressly refers to technology. Every other point doesn't go anywhere near talking about technology specifically. So this is my last slide, and what I've tried to do in this assignment is to really figure out my own philosophies of technology and education. And I've also tried to organize this presentation in kind of a rhizomal way that cuts across domains of learning. So I've tried to hit on knowledge, discovery, evaluation, creativity, but in a way that these are integrated with knowledge, for instance, shifting as I engage in discovery and evaluation and creativity. So what I've done here is just sort of some brainstorming about what a faceted rhizomal taxonomy might look like. And I don't know, I've put some points here, some strengths and maybe weaknesses. Uh, I think I do a good job here of depicting interrelatedness. Um, I think it's a flexible taxonomy. I don't know if it's very prescriptive. I don't know. Um, yeah, I think I've run out of time, so I'll probably end there. Um, and I guess just before I go, I'll end by saying one line, my favorite line from Sunday's episode from the new Star Trek series. And that line is, universal law is for lackeys. Context is for kings. And I will end on that note.